Welcome to the Institute for Management Studies Leadership Conversations podcast, where we have leading thought leaders discussing their research and identifying ways that you can incorporate it to take your learning and development to the next level. Welcome, everyone, to this IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. My name is Charles Good. I'm your host today and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to highlight relevant research and practical applications from esteemed leadership experts and practitioners. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Stacey Hanke, who is the best-selling author of 2 books, Influence, Redefined, Be the Leader You Are Meant to Be Monday to Monday, and Yes, You Can, Everything You Need to Know from A to Z to Influence Others and Take Action. Her books provide practical and immediate skills and techniques that have given thousands the ability to enhance their influence Monday to Monday. Thanks for joining me today, Stacey.
Thank you, Charles. I love doing this, so thanks for trusting me with your members on this topic.
Thank you. And I love to start each of these episodes with just a little bit of your background. And I love part of your bio stated your work ethic was forged in your childhood years growing up on a farm. So I'd love for you to elaborate and let us know what those values that living on a farm and being part of that environment taught.
Yeah, my dad would love this right now, but this is the only part that he would watch. But if any of your members grew up on a farm, they know what I mean by that. My dad was so much about this whole concept of Monday to Monday. Everything that you do every day would always predict our income at the end of the year, right? Whatever we planted in the spring would predict our income at the end of the year. And working on a farm is no easy task. So I would just watch my dad from afar and how dedicated he was. At 5 a.m., he'd be up every day. And it was all on him to make sure that whatever he did every day, again, would predict what our year looked like. So if I was asked yesterday about another podcast, they said, so who's your hero? And I really got to say my dad is. He ingrained in us not only that work ethic, Charles, but it was awesome. My dad, I remember he would always tell my sisters and I, all you have to do to be 1%, the top 1% is follow up. That was one of his messages, or follow through. And I always thought, well, that seems pretty easy. I think I can do that. And the second, we all need to hear this today, is be kind. I remember going to grade school, my dad would say, I'd come home, he'd ask, did you talk to the janitor today? Did you say good morning to him? He was always, you be kind to everyone. You never know who is going to need you and when you're going to need their help. I think that is so ingrained in just starting my business 20 years ago, will be 20 years this year, and just the relationships that we have built. It all kind of stemmed from once a farm girl, it's hard to take that work ethic out of you.
That's a great way. Work ethic is so important to any leader, and being kind, you're right. There can't be a more valuable skill today, along with resilience, to get leaders through these difficult times. Love how you stated that you gave up your pitchfork to take your message across the country. And I love the message or the statement that you're helping leaders see and hear what the audiences see and hear, rather than what they believe to be true. And I think that's so important with leaders to really have that clarity and transparency and understanding and self-awareness, right, for their development as well. How do you make that message connect with leaders and get them over that initial resistance for them to be able to hear that kind of message?
Yeah, because that's a tough message, right? Especially for someone that doesn't know me, it doesn't understand my approach. Now, you've seen my message and my program so many times, so you know exactly where I'm going to go with this. I cannot prove that comment unless I give leaders an opportunity to see themselves, to hear themselves through the eyes and ears of the listeners. Well, the only way I know how to do that is they've got to record themselves. We've got the capability. I have individuals record themselves on their phone, because when they watch the playback, there tends to be a disconnect, especially if you have not taken that action step in a while, whether it's for personal conversations or professional conversations. When you can take a look and really listen to what everyone else is seeing, the big initial shock, Charles, is there's this disconnect of we feel a certain way, similar to you and I today. I probably feel different during this interview than what I'm coming across as. I don't know, but it's that feeling is not connected to your level of influence. Saying that you know what to say, this is a topic you talk about all the time, or I'm comfortable, I feel good. None of that validates you've got influence Monday to Monday. You're consistently influencing others to take action. Once those leaders start taking a closer look, once they start getting feedback, real feedback, none of this nice good job. That was great. That people will get you nowhere. Once you take on those two tasks, I think that's where you really get a chance to not just increase your awareness, but you increase your behavior, how you show up on Zoom or how you're showing up. If some of you are doing some in-personal conversations, you're so much more aware in the moment than you are if you never record yourself.
Well, you're right. And I've recorded myself many times and learned a great deal, even though initially it was difficult to see, right? Because you're like, oh no, because I feel that many people are their own worst critic, right? So
Right.
you have to focus on one thing at a time, or at least that's the approach I found most helpful in going through those. But being able to have that feedback is essential.
Yeah. Because without it, and I know leaders, especially, I get this a lot from my clients. Once I start climbing that corporate ladder, or I get to a point in my career, no one tells the VP of sales, for example, that he or she takes too long to get to the point. Instead, it's so much easier to just say how good that person is. That's the piece that's really tough is the feedback. Or I hear even too, Charles, it depends on a company's culture. Many times I'll hear individuals say, you know, our culture is very nice, which is fine. So then it's more of a training. How can we teach these leaders how to give constructive feedback, how to set up and prepare for the feedback so it's not seen as something you did something wrong and now I have to correct it. It's more, no, we value your position. That's why you're the VP or whatever director, whatever position you are, and you're the face of the company. And what I mean by that, Charles, is every single person listening to this interview right now is under surveillance 24/7. We're always under surveillance, and influence is more than sights and sounds. It's every time we show up and how we come across. So the feedback and the recordings is absolutely critical for someone to really take a closer look, to be able to make a change.
You're right. And not only the leader needs to want that feedback, but you're right. The culture of the company needs to be structured in such a way that it also encourages that as well. And why don't we go ahead and define, or why don't you define for me what you mean by influence and those 6 parts in a little more detail?
Right. And that's why the book is called Influence Redefined. Is I spent about 3 years researching that book to really hone in on what is influence. It really comes from the individuals that I've worked with over the years. It's body language and messaging. They have to be consistent Monday to Monday. Now, this is important in the world that we're living, because I've noticed individuals that I know personally, how they show up here virtually is different than when they're in person.
You're right.
Anytime you're showing up a little differently, people start guessing. And once you're inconsistent, they start to question your trust. Think of consistency really eliminates doubt in your listener's mind. That's one definition. The other side of it that you've heard me say before is influence means you have ability to drive people, to move people to take action long after the interaction has occurred. I mean, look at how long you and I have known each other, and our relationship just didn't get bonded, created in for one interaction. It's a series of how you interact with individuals, that it's the same, it's consistent. My coach always says to me, Stacey, make sure that when you're interacting with someone, that there is always that call to action. That's part of moving the conversation forward. Think of every interaction is to be set up for an invitation for the next conversation.
That's a great way of looking at it. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, it's so diverse with influence and impact and what people mean, but I love your definition of it. Love the book. A lot of great insights around that. Let's talk about some of the myths around influence. But before we do that, try to give me some more clarification or understanding, because I know influence is different virtually than live and in person. In what ways is it more difficult to attain that same level of influence?
Yeah. I think the first big challenge is you're hearing a lot of people are tired of the Zoom. And I don't think it's technically Zoom fatigue. I think they've just experienced some really bad meetings. Maybe it's they weren't interactive. They were just ahead. They had no interaction with the person they're talking to. The first challenge is the lack of interaction that we do. And if you could just take a step back and reflect on how do you interact when you're in person? Maybe it's even just interacting with your family or friends on the weekends. How can you take your natural behaviors of what you do in person and how can you do the same thing here? My goal is always to make you feel like I'm sitting in a room next to you. Now it's another part of the setup. And I know this is crazy because we've been here for 2 years doing virtual. I'm still helping people with the virtual setup. And you and I you're seeing a lot of me, right? I'm about mid stomach right now that you get to see all of this versus a lot of times people show up with literally, it looks like their head is resting on their desk. Well, you would never do that in person. The setup is huge. The interaction is key to make sure that you're not the only voice. And then the third is you've got to really be able to adapt your message these days. I think the more you can adapt to where they are sitting today, what's on their mind, what do they think about, what is their challenge, the more you can do that, the more you're going to keep their attention. Focus on your listeners' why. Why did they show up? Because they didn't have to show up, but make it worth their time to, again, invite that next conversation, right? We want to drive interaction for a long time. We want to drive that influence for a period of time versus just one interaction.
I can attest to some of those challenges. I mean, we've run over 400 virtual offerings in the past few years, and engagement is always an issue virtually, right? Is trying to identify their why and trying to get them to connect, to communicate, because it's so much easier live and in person when you have that audience than it is when they're in the background, not with their cameras on, right? And they're trying to listen to a program and maybe they're only partially paying attention.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a challenge.
There's so many challenges I'm hearing now from clients. Some of our clients that are starting to do some in-person conversations, they're sharing that been here for 2 years and now I go in person and there's a level of vulnerability because again, you can only see so much of me. They're realizing, whoa, when I'm in person, I can't see myself anymore, right? Not that you're constantly staring at your tile here, but it is different, yet it's the same. Meaning create the same behaviors, think through your message like you would do in person. I know, Charles, if you agree, when we first started the lockdown, we were really lenient with how people showed up. And that was legit because everyone was trying to figure out, where's my space? How do I do this?
You're right.
2 years into it though, your name is on everything that you do. Every interaction is an opportunity to enhance your personal brand or jeopardize it. And once you start jeopardizing it here, it's going to be tough to gain that trust when you do get outside of your tile.
No, I agree. I mean, we have, a lot of issues in the last 6 months, or everyone's had up their game, right? Because there's a lot less margin of error for the audience that's coming to see us, right? They don't want the technical issues, the audio, the video. They don't want the distractions in the background. They want an engaged learning experience. So you're right. I mean, that latitude that we've given them initially has gone away. And it's also caused us to up our game to keep up with those times and to keep people engaged, because the level of engagement that we've seen in the last 6 months, I mean, it's harder to keep them engaged now than it was 6 months ago or 12 months.
I agree.
Zoom fatigue, so many of these, it's been more difficult. And that kind of goes into some of these myths people have, not only with the virtual ones, but around influencing and how they are perceived as an influential leader. Like the most common one that I hear is that because of my title comes with a certain level of influence, which I disagree with, because people, just like with authority, right? Someone once told me having authority and being in a position of authority is two different things. And I think the same way about influence, that you might have a title that would assume that you have a certain amount of influence, but not necessarily the case. Do you agree with that? Can you elaborate on that, Stacey? Because I know that I'm sure you get that comment as well, that you're a VP, you're a president, you're a CEO, and I'm an influential person just because of that.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I can honestly tell you that I have worked with CEOs who assistants have much more influence than they do. And I think what happens is, again, you climb the corporate ladder and no one gives you feedback. And many times the people I mentor will say exactly that. We love you and we hate you, Stacey. Like, well, let's get to the hate part. What is it? They'll say, you tell us what no one else tells us. No one's going to tell the CEO, wow, you ramble. It's hard to follow your message. And suddenly there's something about the feeling. We really rely on our feeling to determine our level of effectiveness. And I think that's safe to say in anything. I mean, if you've done anything that takes muscle memory, I use a lot of sports analogies. I think you might have heard me use this one. where it's a documentary on Michael Jordan. I think you've heard me share this before. It's called Last Dance. And in that documentary, he talks about what he did to be Michael Jordan. He was constantly working on his craft. That's what makes him great, but that's what keeps him great. He shared how it was 1,000 shots a day and 6,000 in a week. Think about the math. Right now, when we're recording this, the Olympics is going on. And when I watch the Olympics, I can't even imagine the time, the hours that they dedicate that. Therefore, I'm not telling your members that you have to carve out an hour every day to practice. Here's what you start to do is every interaction that you have, you start thinking through at least one skill. You mentioned earlier, you're practicing one skill at a time. Maybe your next call, think about your brevity or lack thereof. Then your next call, think about just how your overall posture, your body movements is seen in this tile. And suddenly you'll get to close to 1,000. You could get to close to 1,000 shots at least in a couple of days. My point being, you have to make the shots in order to get past that. This is how I feel versus really how much influence I have. You've got to do the work.
That's great. I mean, I remember an interview by Will Smith, the actor, and he said, and he tells this story about a treadmill, right? And he said, there's two things. I mean, if you and I get on a treadmill together, there's two results. And he says, either you're going to get off first or I'm going to die trying. I mean, it's sickening work ethic that he values, because he said there's people that are smarter than him. There's people that are more talented, but no one's going to outwork him. And having those opportunities throughout the day that you identify to practice these skills and breaking them down into manageable components is so critical, because without practice, you're right, without experimenting, you can't get better. You have to start the practice piece. It's great to analyze it, to know your weaknesses, but you can't skip that piece of practicing and experimenting. And over time, you're going to get better. And there's no other shortcuts, I don't think, to really being successful outside of just hard work, practice, repeat the cycle, right? Rinse and repeat.
Yeah. Oh my, and as I hear you saying what you're saying, I say that all the time, but now when I hear you say it, it sounds so common sense. And I always tell my listeners, common sense is not common practice. If this was so easy, everyone would be great communicators, effective, however you define it. And I don't coach, I don't teach IMS members to be perfect communicators. I don't want you to be perfect. It's more about being conscious that when you're in a conversation, whatever that conversation is, you recognize when you're either saying something or your delivery is a distraction rather than an enhancement, and that you're able to change it on the fly. You're right, though. There's no easy answer. A lot of my clients want the easy answer. Can you give us just one way? What is one way to do it? Well, there's not one way, because you and I are different. You've got to try it on over and over, because the other big hiccup is, let's say brevity is something that you're working on and you accomplish that. Well, you're going to get comfortable again, and you'll start going and creating new bad habits. Without recording yourself on a consistent basis, you don't realize when bad habits have now creeped in. You start recording yourself and you'll realize that influence, the way that we're talking about it today, influence is a process. It's a journey. It's just you get to control the driver's seat here, and you're in the driver's seat to really decide, what does that journey look like for you?
You're right. Well, that's the mantra that I end every episode with, is that it's not what you know. It's really what you do consistently that matters, right? Because if it was just what you know, we'd all be billionaires with six-pack abs. We would have it all, right? I mean, you got to do it consistently over a longer period of time. And I think that's where a lot of things break down, is not developing those good habits and then keeping, like you said, persistent with those on a daily, weekly basis, so that you don't get complacent. You don't have that level where you feel like, okay, I've made it. Now I can focus on other things, because this is one skill, the communication piece, that always could be improved, right? It's an art form in many ways. And some of those characteristics that you mentioned in the book about being influential, I love those. And those are great for any leader, not only to be influential, but just to be more successful, more effective as a leader. And two, I'd like to highlight. One is, the trustworthiness, right? That's so hard to get. And once you get it, it only takes one error on your side really to lose it, and to build it back up over a long period of time that's the big challenge. But for a new leader coming into the role, or for a leader coming into the
Mhm.
organization, what have you found to be one of or some of the most effective ways to build that trust? Realizing that it's a process that you have to do over time, but are there any tips or advice around that piece of it that
Yeah.
can make them more influential by building that trust with their team right away?
Yeah. This again is, if you just be common sense, but how many leaders don't do this is you've got to take the time to really get to know people and speak from the heart. I mean, I'll watch individuals try to get to know their team, and I'm thinking, no, 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 no. This conversation is all about you. It's asking the right questions, asking the open-ended questions to really figure out who are they, what's important to them. One of the questions I always ask anytime we bring someone new on the team is, what type of leader are you looking for? What kind of communication? What best works for you? How often? Like, really just figure out what makes them work. That alone, communicates to that individual, okay, here's someone that actually cares, is actually taking the time to invest in me. Please don't confuse micromanagement with that. I'm not saying I don't vote for the micromanagement, taking the time to get to know someone and really making it a two-way street, that, this isn't just me learning this new role or you learning this new role. We're doing it together. I think the demand of that is more critical now than ever before, because individuals have so many options now that if they don't feel respected and they don't feel the trust, the door is so easy to exit.
Part of establishing the trust is really kind of parlaying it with authenticity, right? And that's another one of those critical skills that you kind of mentioned of characteristics of
Mhm.
influential people is to develop that trust. You need to be authentic. You need to come across as genuine and show some vulnerability, like you were saying, so that people feel like that they can relate to you more. What
Mhm.
are some ways that they could be or show their authenticity if they're coming into that role or in a new organization?
Yeah. The first one is one that we've already talked about, Charles, and that's consistency. When you really start messing with authenticity, when you show up different ways. And I'm working with someone right now that's what we're working on, because the way he'll show up with his leadership team is different how he's showing up with his team. And there's a lot of conflict there. There is also a different way that he shows up at home than he does at work. And I bring this up because I want you to just kind of check in with, how authentic are you when you're around people that you're very comfortable with? And how do you build trust there? A lot of it is look people dead in the eyes. Look at people right here in that camera to make them feel like they are the most important person in the room. The second is asking even personal questions, just for people to realize that you want to get to know them on a personal level too. The consistency, though, is key. Consistency equals authenticity, which equals trust.
I love that. Well, let's talk about the pyramid you have in your book about the elements that drive influence.
Yeah.
So if they want to know how to become more influential, they start at the bottom and they work their way up. Self-awareness. I love that being the first piece, because if you're not self-aware, you have too many blind spots. You really don't know how, like what you say, how other people are perceiving you. So I love to start out with that one and say, are there ways in which you can build more self-awareness, especially like what you said, because that's the biggest
Mhm.
challenge to leaders at the top. No one's going to give you honest feedback. They're going to go through a filter of, okay, should I really give this, and giving you more positive rather than negative, but that's not what improves you.
Yeah.
That's not what takes your leadership skills, your success to the next level. So how do leaders, especially leaders more at the top of an organization, how do they get that self-awareness? If not through feedback, then what are some other ways?
Yeah. Those are the only two that I know of that I practice and my team practices. It's obviously the recordings, and you can just do it on your phone as much as possible. There's one thing you take from this interview: record yourself. That's it. And I challenge everyone, do it at least once a day for the next 7 days and watch it. When you watch it, here's the way to increase your self-awareness as well. Keep in mind what you felt like during the conversation versus what reality states, what you're seeing on here. The feedback, I find, Charles, it's helpful if you can have an accountability partner, someone to give you
Right.
feedback in your personal life and your professional life. Because are you two completely different people? Now, I get it. There's certain things. I'm not saying you need to share everything about your personal life in the professional world, but you have to have some consistency, because influence is not something you can't turn these behaviors on and turn them off. It's not authentic. People will notice it. What will really increase your self-awareness, I am guessing 2 years, sharing your space perhaps with other loved ones in your house. We've all created our own WeWork or what do they call it? Co-working space or something like
Right.
that, right?
Exactly.
Asking your family members are the biggest investment you're going to make in a coach. And how you do that is before you have a conversation, perhaps tonight at dinner, ask for one piece of feedback just for 2 minutes during the conversation. You don't have to be giving feedback constant. That's also what helps increase the self-awareness of how you set up the feedback back up for work. For example, let's say before we start recording this, I would have asked you, Charles, here's what I'm working on. Would you give me feedback after? And that way I'm guiding you on exactly what I want feedback. It's going to benefit me and it makes it easier on you as well. Number three, another way to give feedback is if you can do it in the moment. If we work recording and it was just you and I hanging out, having a conversation, that's where I would say to you, here's what I'm working on. Would you give me feedback in the moment? And you've seen me do this. You've seen me do this on some of our trainings. That's feedback. So it's really identifying what do you want, be very clear on it, then being consistent on doing those two. You can't start and stop it because your self-awareness will never get to that point where we want to get you to the point where you're aware of what you're doing well, what's not working well in these high stakes conversations.
Well, I love how you connected as well, because I think it's important, as you know, I mean, to record yourself and for you to evaluate yourself, but it's also like what you say, you want to know how other people perceive you. So you could be still missing stuff even by recording yourself. So asking those questions to people that you trust and hopefully clarifying it in such a way that you do get that honest feedback, right? That you
Right.
just don't want the kudos or the good things, but tell me in these areas and I promise no retribution or to get defensive, but I really want your honest feedback because I'm really wanting to improve, right? I mean, that's my goal
Right.
here. And so it's always difficult, I think, as you go up higher and higher in the organization, even to ask those questions, but to still get that honest feedback. That's why a coach like yourself is so essential to those types of leaders, just to have someone coming in that's not part of the organization, that has no vested interest, and that you're paying to give that honest feedback too.
Yes. I'll never forget him. This was a number of years ago, and he's a very well-known CEO, someone that I admired, Charles. I saw him as a really strong leader. He had increased morale like by 75% once he got into that role. Super successful. However, no one ever gave him feedback really around his communication. I shared with you the whole video recording, and I decided the only way I'm going to be able to increase his awareness is I recorded him. And we were working in person that day. He recorded himself having a conversation that he was going to replay back at the office later that day. We sit down and we're watching his video playback. Easily 5 seconds, maybe 10 seconds. He looks at me while he's watching that playback and he says, I bet you wonder how I ever became a CEO. And it was an awkward moment when I asked him, well, where's that coming from? He said, well, I watched the playback. I realized no one on my executive team has ever given me feedback. When I asked him, what are you going to do with this? His response was, I'm firing my executive team. But if it's anyone, this is not just for the top of the top or someone brand new in their career. Me included in this comment, we all speak to when y'all lot throughout the day. We all can use improvement.
So I think it's having that attitude, right, where you want it as well. I mean, that, there's certain leaders that may not even want it and they stop growing as a result. So I think that's so critical as well. So this pyramid, it starts with self-awareness. Next step is consistency, then reputation, adaptability, and then the impact. So how long to get through? I mean, it sure depends on the person.
Right.
But if you feel like, do many people start at the beginning? Do you always recommend them starting at self-awareness, regardless if they're farther along the path than others? Or what is the best approach to take as someone goes through these steps?
Yeah. Those are the first two, self-awareness and consistency is the only order that I recommend people follow. From there, all the other elements is what I refer to them as. It's going to depend on what happened with the self-awareness. And think of the self-awareness. We start there because it's a baseline. It's going to your tennis coach. You haven't gone to a coach for 10 plus years. And the first thing they'll ask you to do is, we need a baseline. Serve a couple of times. I just want to see your form. And once that coach starts evaluating, now we're at a base, right? So for you to be at that base of, okay, here's what's working for me, here's what's not, based on what I know, now you have to be consistent with how you practice. And from there, you're jumping around that model just based on, because I've worked with individuals who may not have a lot of self-awareness of how they come across, but yet they have impact. The power there is, well, they don't even realize their strengths. And everything that they're doing well with how they show up and their messaging is actually having impact, and they don't even realize it. So I know we've been kind of talking about what you can prove if you're weak at. The benefit of recording yourself is also recognizing, wow, I didn't realize that is actually one of my strengths. I probably should continue to work on that as well.
Well, you're right. Amplify your strengths, right? Instead of just working on your weaknesses. And many people, I think, are their toughest critics. So they're going to look at their weaknesses and say,
Right.
oh, no, I got to do this. I got to do that. But I mean, that's so important and critical as well, just to identify, okay, here's something I feel like I'm good at. And I've gotten some feedback from others that validate that. And
Hmm.
how can I amplify it even more, right? How can I make
Right.
myself being better in those ways? Because in many super successful leaders, it's taking one or two strengths, combining them in such a way that now you have a competitive advantage, right? And not focusing on building the other areas up.
Hmm. And that's
I
what we
agree.
really dig deep into, to really figure out, well, let's enhance your strengths. That's going to be my first task with anyone, because weaknesses, I always joke about, I'm not good at accounting. I don't do accounting. You hire someone else to do accounting. And I'll even recognize with someone's communication, there's certain things that just don't work for them for whatever reason, but they're not as noticeable when we can really focus on the strength as well.
That's a great way of putting it. Well, as we reach the end of this episode, I always like to end with a call to action. So, Stacey, is there one thing that you would recommend leaders listening to this podcast to start first?
Yeah.
I think I know what it is, but just why don't we
You know what it is, right?
reiterate it just one more time? Just we want to just make sure this point gets driven home.
I say record me, because even if you can't really ask for feedback first, because you might not be able to set it up the way that will give you the greatest value because you haven't seen yourself through the eyes and ears of your listeners, I would do that. And I guarantee if you make that part of your development on a regular basis, you'll make changes really quickly. That your leaders, your members will see the benefit. You'll start to wanting to do it perhaps with your children, depending on their ages. Not that, all children could use it, but also on your teams. And what a powerful role model to focus on their development, that communication's the core to everything that we do. Probably more essential now after these last 2 years than it's ever been.
I would agree. Any resources you can provide our listeners regarding their influence or any recommended readings, including your book?
Yeah, obviously mine, right? But I'm not going to just give mine. I'll give mine first, only because we've got a lot of resources on social media. I know you're following us too, Charles, and it's on our website. It's Stacey with an EY, HANKEINC.com. A lot of complimentary material that we share. Another one, only because you brought it up, we talked a little bit about trust. Check out my good friend, David Horsager. It's spelled Horsager. And he is known as the trust guru. He's written several books on that piece. That's one. And I'll give you one more. There's another friend of mine. His name is Phil Jones. He talks a lot about words that matter. He's written a couple of books about that concept. He even just wrote a children's book about it for kids. I think because those two elements, both Phil, David, and I, kind of cross paths in the work that we do.
Great. Any final thoughts before we wrap up for today, or if you want to give them any additional contact information to get a hold of you?
Yeah, I really think it's taking this week, and after whatever you grab from this interview, put a plan together. I tend to do 30 days. Where do you want to be with your communication in the next 30 days? 30 days is easy to do. From there, I will always evaluate every 30 days, and then I evaluate every quarter, every 90 days. And if you've really gotten the habit of doing that, imagine December 31st of 2022, when you're ringing in the new year, things could sound a lot different than perhaps where you are today.
I couldn't agree more. It's a lot about that process and routines that you got to follow and follow them consistently enough to see those results. Well, this concludes this episode of the IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found on both Apple and Spotify and can also be accessed at the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Stacey.